relentless missteps and, who knew what, when and why didn't he? Or is this also just being punished for cost of living and the general mood of electorates around the place at the moment, including yours?
I think it's a really smart question, Catherine, and I think you're right. It's not just about personal mistakes. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, one is, for some reason, the British public just do not like Keir Starmer. They see him as being untrustworthy, sort of shifty, very much the politician. So there's a personal element. But the other stuff that you hit on, it absolutely is the case. And it's not just in Britain. It's something that haunts kind of Western advanced economies everywhere. It's that sense that you've got stagnating living standards. People feel as though nothing in Britain works properly anymore, major whinge on all of the public services. And then there's a real issue on the third thing, which is sort of social cohesion, the idea that people are unhappy about the levels of immigration, about how we all get on in these islands. So in other words, it's not just about Starmer. I'm trying to think of a nice way of putting this, Catherine, but there isn't really a nicer way than saying Britain is an unhappy, angry place at the moment. Like lots of other places, right? But we are an unhappy, angry place.
Rob, thank you. Rob Watson, BBC political correspondent. Coming up to 10 o'clock, lots and lots of feedback from you, particularly on KiwiSaver. Thank you. We will get to that in the next hour. We're going to hear from Quinn Davis. As I mentioned earlier, Morning Report, we're talking about food waste and just how much of it there is, what organisations are or aren't doing well. One idea that is working is an app. It's called Gone Good. You can get bags of mystery, unsold food from local eateries at the end of the day for around a third of the normal cost. I think there's around 100 or so eateries involved in that. We'll hear more about how it is working. Later in parenting, how to equip teens for what they are experiencing of the manosphere online and, of course, spilling into real life. One high school in Dunedin is really focused on equipping its students. We'll hear how it's doing it. And comedian James Nokise is with me next on a couple of forthcoming shows. We'll look back over his career as well after RNZ's News Bulletin.
RNZ News at 10. Kia ora, good morning. I'm Nicola Wright. The Finance Minister is reading Moody's decision to downgrade New Zealand's economic outlook as a validation of her government's economic strategy and response to the fuel crisis. The credit rating agency has reaffirmed New Zealand's top-tier AAA rating, but shifted its outlook from stable to negative. Nicola Willis says Moody's choice to put New Zealand on negative watch is another warning that New Zealand can't afford to simply spend more and borrow more. The government's response to the fuel crisis so far has been limited to targeted assistance to low-income families. Ms Willis says with global interest rates rising, New Zealand must keep its books in order. The police say many petrol stations are moving to prepay only because of an increase in fuel thefts since the Iran war started pushing prices up. Assistant Commissioner Tasha Penny says police have been talking with petrol station owners about what they can do to stop people driving off without paying.
The ideal state is everyone moves to prepaid. And you're right, we're seeing smaller stations taking action because they're just seeing too much of this theft.
Tasha Penny says police have laid more than 370 charges since the beginning of March. Iran's top negotiator says a ceasefire in the war only makes sense if the American blockade of Iranian ports and ships in the Strait of Hormuz ends. The ABC's Middle East correspondent Matthew Doran reports.
Yesterday, the US president extended the ceasefire with Iran, which was due to expire within hours. At the time, Donald Trump claimed the Iranian regime's leadership was seriously fractured. He didn't specify how long the extension was for, but US media outlets are reporting it's at least 3 days. In response, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, who led the country's delegation, has said there's little point pursuing a ceasefire if the US blockade of the Strait of Hormuz continues, labelling that a breach of the truce. Overnight, Iran has seized 2 ships in the strait.
The Labour Party is expected to reveal imminently whether it will give its support to the free trade deal between India and New Zealand. Labour's leader Chris Hipkins and his trade spokesperson Damien O'Connor are due to speak to reporters at Parliament soon. A formal signing in New Delhi is planned for Monday. However, New Zealand First's firm opposition to the deal means National and ACT need Labour's support in order to pass legislation to enact parts of the agreement. A National MP says a comment made by New Zealand First's deputy leader during a discussion about the free trade deal, referring to a butter chicken tsunami, is racist. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon says Shane Jones' remark is unacceptable, but is not labelling it racist. Mount Roskill MP Carlos Chung is.
I think any racist comment is unacceptable, especially myself as a migrant as well. I feel that more than the others. I feel that it is racist. This is why we want to stand by my Indian community or my even migrants community as well.
Asked how he felt about his colleagues not calling out the comments, Carlos Chung said different people have different feelings. Wellington City Missioner says staff have seen an influx of flood-hit residents from all walks of life this week. The capital has been under a state of emergency since Monday's torrential rain. Murray Edridge says flash floods have hit some of the city's most vulnerable people.
They're struggling. Some of them are people who are living rough or in difficulty anyway. But a number of them have been quite elderly, and we've also had people with a variety of disabilities. They require particular care and attention.
Murray Edridge says City Mission and Council staff have been working around the clock to provide support and accommodation. Problems that halted checking in for domestic Jetstar flights in Auckland have now been fixed. Check-ins at the airline were paused while crews worked to resolve technical issues. Jetstar says they affected kiosks and baggage systems. It says all systems are now working normally, but the disruption could delay some flights out of Auckland.
I've written to the Prime Minister to confirm that the Labour Party will support the legislation enabling the India Free Trade Agreement to come into force. In our discussions with the government, they have made a number of commitments, including speeding up the visa processing time for those workers in New Zealand seeking to change employer, in some cases getting that down to as quick as 5 days for processing those visas. They've also committed to support the modern slavery legislation and provide some resources, some legal resources, to those who are the victims of potential migrant worker exploitation. And they've made some further commitments which I've set out in our media statement. We still remain concerned about the government signing New Zealand up to potentially $20 billion worth of investment in India. We think that's an unrealistic target. That is not something that the Labour Party would have signed New Zealand up for, but the current government have. So all of our exporters who seek to take advantage of the opportunities this trade agreement provides need to do their own due diligence. They need to understand the risks, and particularly the risks that 15 years down the track they could have some of that market access revoked by India. Those are ultimately commercial decisions that exporters will need to make, and my message to them is make sure they do their own due diligence because the government have left them exposed to risk in the way they've negotiated this agreement. No, absolutely not. I think it's a very unrealistic target. I think it is almost impossible for New Zealand to ever meet that target, and that is one of the things our exporters will need to be aware of. India have reserved the right to claw back the concessions they've granted New Zealand in the event that New Zealand businesses don't invest $20 billion US in India. New Zealand businesses won't do that, and so they need to be aware that there is still a risk there. Ultimately, businesses will be able to make those decisions for themselves. We've gone as far as we can go in the due diligence that we can do around that particular provision. We're not going to stop the agreement proceeding because of it, but businesses need to be aware that that is a risk to them. Sorry, let Damien...
Look, can we just be clear that the agreement is to promote the investment to that level? The judgment that will be made in 15 years' time is whether we've done enough to promote that. And so it's a grey area, but exporters need to be clear that if this government or subsequent governments don't invest enough in the promotion, then the Indians can claw back the concessions that this FTA offers.
Have you seen the full contract of the deal?
We've seen. We were given a copy of the deal. Now there was still, yes, but there was still discussion ongoing. So there may have been some changes to that. But based on the information that we've been provided in good faith, we've made our decisions based on that.
What form of the government's
So it's a combination of verbal reassurances and written reassurances. So the Prime Minister has put in writing their commitment that anyone seeking to change employer under the new TEE visa will have that application processed within 5 working days. And there have been verbal reassurances about the ongoing work that the government claim they're doing to speed up the process for others who are seeking to change employer. This is important to us because migrant workers who are locked into a particular employer are potentially more exposed to being treated poorly than those who can change employer. And that is one of the risks of the accredited employer scheme, for example. So the reassurance from the government that they're going to try and speed up the processing of those change of conditions applications is important.
But presumably those changes would have come into effect before the legislation passes through the stages. So there's nothing, if the government was to go back on its word, there wouldn't be any meaningful.
Well, there is a budget between now and then, and the government have made some specific commitments, which we've set out some information on in our press statement, but I'm not going to go announcing the government's budget for them, but they've given us some commitments there.
How unusual is it to have a situation where the government has had to approach the opposition to get such a significant deal passed?
There generally has been bipartisanship around these deals. Unfortunately, that hasn't been on display from the government until basically right now. I think they've treated this process cavalierly. They didn't engage with us when they were doing the negotiations. They didn't engage with us constructively through the last 4 months. We've had to sort of drag the information out of them that we're seeking. The most recent advice we got, particularly around the legal advice we were able to review, we only got on Monday. So it has taken us some time to get the information out of them to be able to make an informed decision. There have been about 5 formal meetings. There have been plenty of informal discussions, but they have not provided the information we've been asking for. So every time we've met with them, we've asked them for information which they haven't provided.
Are you suggesting that in all of the trade agreements that you guys did during your time in government, that when you were at the negotiating stage, you were freely handing over information to the opposition at the time? Because that seems to be what you're asking for, but it doesn't feel like that was what you guys were doing when you were in government.
All circumstances are different. The current government knew that they did not have the support of their own cabinet to negotiate this deal last year, and they chose not to engage with the opposition until the negotiations or had already concluded. That is not good faith, and that is not bipartisanship.
You've already made it clear that trade deals are for the most part bipartisan, and that Labor was probably going to vote for it anyway, and it got to a point of them having had the negotiations. They then have had a number of meetings with you and a lot of back and forth. Tom McClay has said that part of the delay has been because Damien will be out of the country and they've been waiting for you to come back to talk to him. So are you honest about
that is simply not true. They only provided the legal advice we had been asking for from the beginning on Monday this week. In all of my correspondence, when the paper trail is released, and we'll leave that up to the government to release that, because it does contain information that's currently provided to us with an obligation of confidence, but I'm happy for all of my correspondence to the Prime Minister to be released. It will show that whenever he's written to me or communicated with me, we've responded almost immediately. No. And I want to be really clear about that. This was something that we tested, as we should do, in understanding what the agreement that they've signed us up to commits us to. Those entering under the TEE visa could enter New Zealand already under the skilled migration pathway. So it's unlikely to increase the overall level of migration from India to New Zealand. Winston Peters, I think it's more than dog whistling. I mean, I think what New Zealand First have been doing is downright racist. If you look at what Shane Jones has been saying, it's utterly unacceptable. And bearing in mind that these are ministers in Christopher Luxon's government, he should do something about that.
Did you say it was utterly unacceptable when Andrew Little said there were too many Indian chefs coming to New Zealand?
I wasn't, I can't even recall that. So,
2017 election?
yeah, like I said, I can't recall that. But I don't agree with that comment. What was that? It's more the the risks that we've identified. Businesses need to be aware that there are risks involved.
On immigration, does it mean though that a higher portion of the migrants coming to New Zealand will be from India? Is it something though that a high percentage be Indian?
No, I don't think you could draw that conclusion at all, because the people who will be able to apply for the TEE visa could already apply for a skilled migrant visa under our existing immigration settings.
Okay, and in terms of the clawbacks, we don't need the investment thing. What exactly are those clawbacks? Is it for everything in the deal? Or
Yes. Yeah.
So does it nullify the
You guys have gone through this in the actual wording, so...
Look, effectively, yes, it would nullify all the concessions that this FTA offers. So that's a high-risk scenario. The difference between this agreement and previous ones is that over time, usually trade agreements reduce the risk for New Zealand exporters and increase the benefits. This one has the potential to do the opposite, but it is a judgment made on the level of promotion of the investment of the 20 billion US. So that's a judgment that I guess the Indians will make. We have to ensure that we've built up positive commercial partnerships with the Indians and that they see the value in continuing with these concessions, because the alternative could be very, very detrimental to exporters. No, they could take them away, the wording, and Venushi has been through, we've been through the wording. I'll give it to a lawyer if you like.
What time on the Monday? You said you got the legal advice on Monday, this Monday? What time?
Look, we had a meeting with officials. We had been requesting information about 3 months ago. That information dribbled out to us, which was rather frustrating. One of the core cabinet papers that we'd been asking for was only received on Monday.
What time on Monday?
We met at 2 p.m.
2 p.m. Okay, so that was.
I think it would be irresponsible for us or our caucus to make a judgment if we didn't have as much information as we should have. We weren't involved in the negotiation, so we weren't privy to the reasons for decisions, and we didn't have access to that information when the deal was announced. We have been seeking that. Some of that information just came through on Monday.
Was any of the delay due to not wanting to give the government a win?
No.
Not at all.
The remedial map.
Oh, do you want to get into the...
The question is, can the Indians come back after 15 years and say, we'll get everything, or will they go after 3 or 4 years not needing it and let's pull back some?
There are two possibilities. So on the remedial measures relating to the investment, that happens at the 15-year assessment, so the final one. There are other provisions which are bilateral that do allow both parties to change measures. That is normal in terms of trade agreements, but it has to meet a specific standard. And if there's a dispute, that can go to the WTO. So there's not concern about those provisions, but certainly there is about reaching those 15-year targets. I would also say that it doesn't appear that the government have done due diligence in assessing what the scale of that investment activity needs to look like and what that would cost. And when you compare our big investments at present, over 90% of our investments are in 7 countries. That's $15 billion. So we're talking about a one-off for $20 billion, which is quite a different scale.
Chris, you, I think earlier on mentioned some concerns about the process to get visas, making sure there's sufficient business space, given the education. You haven't said anything in terms of government concessions there. Have they agreed to improve any resourcing in that space?
I still have those concerns, but we have been able to meet with officials from NZQA and talk about the quality assurance work that they've been doing. That was work that started under my time as Minister of Education, and good to see that continuing. So I want to acknowledge that work has continued. My concern there is specifically around the potential for low quality education providers to be offering what was previously referred to as the study work settle pathway, which was primarily an immigration pathway rather than an educational one. Our view has been very clear right from the get-go. International education is about education. It's about providing people from around the world the opportunity to access world-class education in New Zealand. It is not primarily an immigration pathway. It can lead to immigration pathways from time to time, but locking that in is something that we would be concerned about.
You mentioned the need for businesses to assess the risks. What are the risks for businesses that you see?
Well, ultimately, if we get 15 years down the track and India starts to claw back access to the market, that creates some risk for businesses who at that point will be doing potentially quite large volumes of business in India. I've said that I'll set that out closer to the election. But because I'll set out, in a more comprehensive way, our views on the other parties in Parliament, where we have common ground and where we don't. And I'm not going to drip that out piecemeal based on events of the day. I am going to do that in a principled way, and we'll do it closer to the election, as we did last time. When we did that last time, we set out who we can work with, areas where we can work with, areas where we disagree with them, and we'll do the same again. Oh. I think Winston Peters has been very clear that a vote for him, a vote for New Zealand First, is a vote to re-elect Christopher Luxon as Prime Minister.
Would you be willing to work with the party that referred to the FTA as voting as Would you be willing to?
I have absolutely condemned that, and I've also been clear that that language is totally unacceptable, and there would be no place for that in any government that I lead. Any minister engaging in that type of racism and race baiting would not be a minister in a government that I lead. Look, I can speak for the 9 months that I was Prime Minister, where I set very high standards for ministers, and where they didn't meet that, they weren't ministers anymore.
So you think that Jacinda Ardern was wrong to have not put those comments out at the time as racist? Is that what you're saying?
I'm setting a very clear benchmark for what will happen under any government that I lead in. I subsequently did, and I absolutely condemned his post. Well, because at that time I don't think I'd seen the post itself. But no, it absolutely was, and I have subsequently been very clear that that post was unacceptable.
Just on Te Pāti Māori, it says that we'll bring a wealth tax to the coalition table. They also say that Labour, that you guys need to work with Te Pāti Māori, and that's where the numbers are. What are your thoughts on that?
We won't be supporting a wealth tax.
But they say they'll bring it to the coalition table.
They can if they want to, but we won't be supporting it. We won't be supporting it. It's full stop, end of story.
Rather than supporting government, you're ruling out a wealth tax to the point that you go back to the polls if they demand it.
Let me be very clear on this. Unlike Christopher Luxon, the Labour Party will not support policies that there is no public mandate for.
So we're going back to the polls.
I don't think it would ever come to that. If Shane Jones continues to engage in that kind of racist rhetoric, that's quite right.
Do you think he will?
Yes.
He will continue to engage in that sort of rhetoric?
Those are questions for Christopher Luxon. He's the Prime Minister at the moment. He should really be doing something about it.
On a wealth tax, there's been some calls for a one-off wealth tax, not a permanent one, to get some of the capital gains that are no longer available for the kind of capital gains tax that you're proposing. Is there any merit in a one-off wealth tax of any kind?
That is not something we've considered. It is not something we will consider.
Mr. Hipkins, can I just get your reaction to the Moody's rating that's come out? Nicola Willis has made the suggestion that the government is picking up the pieces from when Labour was in government when they coughed up so much debt. What do you make of that?
Nicola Willis has borrowed more money. Nicola Willis has increased the government debt. She's increased the government deficit. The government spending has increased. All of the rhetoric and the reality are completely divorced when it comes to this government, much like their relationships with one another, it would seem.
Would you that our forecast has been done?
It's not good news for New Zealand. You know, Nicola Willis said that she was going to fix all of this, and she's made it all worse. We didn't have a credit ratings downgrades during Labour's time in government.
Have you apologised?
Well, we had a fuel crisis during our time in government and a global pandemic, and we managed to get our credit rating upgraded, not downgraded.
Have you apologised?
Well, look, Nicola Willis just continues to dig the hole for New Zealand deeper.
How often are you getting briefings about the fuel situation?
We're not getting very many formal briefings from the government.
Are you going to start asking for that because the situation does look like it's still very tense and could be
Yeah, I mean, we'll certainly be monitoring the situation ourselves, and where we can get access to officials to provide more advice that's useful. Our last meeting with them didn't really provide anything that wasn't already in the public domain.
Have you said sorry to Nicola Willis for your comments in the House
Yes.
yesterday?
Is it by text or?
Yeah, I sent her a text last night. And look, to be clear, until reflecting on it afterwards, I had no idea what she was upset about. I now do, and that was not what I had intended, and so I have apologised to her.
Did she respond to you?
Yes.
What did she say?
Well, she accepted my apology. So.
Was there ever a scenario where Labour wouldn't have supported the India FTA?
Well, you have to consider all of these things on a case-by-case basis. We had a responsibility to do due diligence around it, and we've done that.
I think, can I just on one of the risks on it, which was the implications of the withdrawal of the concessions if we don't meet the target of promoting that huge level and target for investment. I've been in touch with many of the industries. They've put an ad in the paper saying on balance they still support the FTA. That has been useful because it is they who will bear most of the risk should the Indians decide that we haven't met the promotional target.
Look, that is one of the things that we've been probing with the government. It remains an area of ambiguity. And so those are really questions for the government. And in terms of the other question for them is how much resource are they going to put into meeting this promotional commitment? Those are questions for them.
Told the places I can deal with New Zealand export with regard to export product, food, including food product, tariff-free, if they then add value to it in India and then re-export. And if that will be a way that would encourage companies here to invest.
Look, one of the key areas where there are virtually no concessions is dairy. It's our single biggest export. I spoke directly with the dairy industry. On balance, although they don't receive, huge gains here, they think over time they might. That's one of the areas pointed out. If they were to export ingredients into India that are re-exported around the world, then that would go in tariff-free. So there is a small window of opportunity. But for our single biggest export, not to have concessions in a free trade agreement is again quite unique. Well, look, I can't speak for how it would have engaged. It was always going to be a big challenge. Have to be honest about that. We've always accepted it. What they have gained is an opportunity. It's a small opportunity. Hopefully, we can build from that. Can I just say, look, we in government had built up relationships with India. We'd visited and we took an approach that partnerships was the way forward. The government committed to an FTA. Yes, they put a lot of resources in there. And the reality of President Trump and his intervention across the trade world and putting tariffs on, including India, I think assisted with the motivation to get this agreement forward. Yes, they should be congratulated for an agreement. We had a responsibility to ensure that it was a valuable agreement.
Does your refusal to rule out New Zealand first make you a bit delusional? Like he's saying we're never working with you, and you're kind of sitting there going, maybe.
Look, Winston Peters can weld himself to Christopher Luxon if he wants to. I've been clear that we will set out who we can and can't work with closer to the election. I also said that at the last election I ruled out working with New Zealand First in this term had we been forming the government, and that's unlikely to change.
So why can't you say it?
Because we're going to set it out closer to the election, and we will cover all of the parties in Parliament. Because we can, it means that we're not doing it based on events of the day, every, day to day. We'll be setting it out in a principled way that gives people certainty around, who we can and can't work with when they go to the polling booth and they make their decision on how to vote.
Are you holding some hope that Winston Peters might change his mind?
No.
Just to be clear, will Labour make any concessions on tax to the likes of the Greens and Te Pāti Māori or even New Zealand First?
We've been really clear on what our tax policy is. That is the policy that Labour will support in government.
So you will not make any concessions on tax to the other parties?
In terms, we've ruled out a wealth tax, we've ruled out land taxes, we've been very clear on those things.
So you would resign as Prime Minister rather than go through with the wealth tax?
The Labour Party will not support a tax policy that we have not campaigned on. Well, it won't come to that because we've been very clear we won't support a policy we haven't campaigned on.
If you get negotiations, they say this is the bottom line, this is the only way we can form a government, you will say no and you'll stand down as Prime Minister.
I mean, Christopher Luxon will still be Prime Minister.
Do you think that you do run a risk, though, of Te Pāti Māori and the Greens saying that really progressive taxation like a wealth tax is a bottom line in those negotiations, and how will you actually deal with those?
None of those parties are saying that is a bottom line for them as far as I'm aware. All right, thanks everyone. Cheers.
That sound quite as good as the women of your family bursting into laughter.